The world of fine art is often associated with high-security vaults, laser grids, and silent, sophisticated alarms that can detect the weight of a single breath. Yet, some of the most profound disappearances occur not through force or digital intrusion, but through the slow, steady passage of time and the invisibility of a person who has become part of the scenery. Imagine a sprawling estate, nestled in a valley where the morning fog lingers long after the sun has begun its ascent. This was Blackwood Manor, a place of ancient stone and deep, velvet greens. To the Van der Meer family, the estate was a sanctuary of history, and at the heart of that history was a painting known as The Girl in the Blue Ribbon. It was a Dutch masterpiece, a work of such delicate light and shadow that it seemed to glow from within, even on the dimmest winter afternoons. For 20 years, the gardens of Blackwood Manor were tended by a man named Arthur. Arthur was a person of quiet habits and few words, possessing a disposition that mirrored the stillness of the grounds he cared for. He arrived every morning when the dew was still heavy on the grass, his boots making a soft, rhythmic crunch on the gravel paths. To the family, Arthur was as much a fixture of the estate as the towering oaks or the marble fountains that lined the terrace. He was the gardener, the silent architect of their privacy, a man who understood the language of soil and season. He moved with a steady, unhurried pace, his hands calloused and stained by the earth, always occupied with the clipping of shears or the gentle weeding of the rose beds. Because he was always there, he was, in many ways, never truly seen. Arthur's work brought him close to the manor house daily. He was responsible for the floral arrangements that graced the grand foyer, a task that required him to enter the house through the servants' entrance, carry his baskets of fresh-cut lilies or peonies through the quiet hallways, and set them upon the mahogany tables. This routine allowed him to pass the gallery doors dozens of times a week. The gallery was a long, narrow room with high windows and polished parquet floors. It was here that the girl in the blue ribbon hung, positioned in a way that the afternoon sun would catch the gold leaf of its frame. Arthur would often linger for just a moment, his eyes resting on the canvas, not with the hunger of a thief, but with the patient observation of a man who watched things grow. Over the years, Arthur's observation turned into an intimate understanding of the manor's internal rhythm. He knew which floorboards in the gallery creaked under the weight of a footstep and which remained silent. He knew that at exactly 4 o'clock, the security guard on duty would take his tea in the small kitchen at the far end of the wing, leaving the gallery unattended for precisely 8 minutes. He noticed how the humidity of a rainy day made the heavy oak doors swell, requiring a slightly firmer push to close, and how the moonlight hit the sensors of the alarm system, creating tiny, invisible corridors of shadow. His plan was not born of a sudden impulse or a desperate need for wealth. Instead, it grew slowly, like a perennial plant, strengthening its roots in the quiet corners of his mind. In the solitude of his small cottage at the edge of the estate, Arthur began to practice a different kind of craft. He was a man of many hidden talents, and among them was a remarkable ability for mimicry. He began to paint. He didn't paint landscapes or portraits of his own invention. Instead, he focused entirely on reproducing the masterpiece he saw every day. He sourced aged canvases from local antique markets and studied the chemistry of 17th-century pigments. He spent his evenings under the soft glow of a lamp, recreating the specific, translucent blue of the girl's ribbon. He worked with the same patience he applied to his boxwood hedges, layering the oils and waiting weeks for them to dry, then intentionally distressing the surface to match the fine web of cracks that time had etched into the original. The years bled into one another, and Arthur's replica became indistinguishable from the original to any but the most expert eye. He waited for the perfect moment, not a moment of chaos, but a moment of absolute normalcy. That moment arrived on a Tuesday in late autumn. A steady, rhythmic rain was falling, the kind of rain that muffled the sounds of the world and kept the family indoors, gathered near the fireplaces in the main living quarters. The air smelled of wood smoke and damp earth. Arthur entered the manor with his usual basket of late-season chrysanthemums. He moved through the halls with the practiced ease of 2 decades of service. When he reached the gallery, the house was silent, save for the distant ticking of a grandfather clock and the soft patter of rain against the glass. The guard was away for his tea. Arthur didn't hurry. His movements were fluid and calm. He stepped into the gallery, his soft-soled work shoes making no sound on the wood. He reached up and lifted the girl in the blue ribbon from its hooks. It was heavier than it looked, the wood of the frame dense and cold. He placed the original into a specially lined compartment in his gardening crate, hidden beneath a layer of damp burlap and fresh flowers. In its place, he hung his replica. He adjusted it by a fraction of an inch, ensuring it sat exactly where the original had been for half a century. He then finished his rounds. He placed the chrysanthemums in the foyer, nodded politely to a passing maid, and walked out the back door into the rain. He spent the rest of his shift trimming the ivy on the north wall, the steady snip-snip of his shears providing a comforting, domestic soundtrack to the afternoon. When the sun began to set, he returned to his cottage, packed a single small suitcase with his few belongings, and placed the original painting, carefully wrapped, inside. He left his keys on the kitchen table, along with a brief, polite note thanking the Van der Meers for their years of employment. He didn't leave in the middle of the night like a fugitive. He simply caught the evening bus at the end of the lane, disappearing into the twilight as just another passenger. The discovery was not made for months. The replica was so masterful, and the lighting in the gallery so dim during the winter months, that no one noticed the change. It wasn't until a visiting art historian arrived in the spring to catalogue the collection that the truth came to light. The historian had noted a slight dullness in the way the light hit the girl's eyes, a lack of the inner fire that the original was famous for. By the time the police were called and the investigation began, the trail was cold. Arthur had vanished as completely as a shadow when the light is turned off. There were no fingerprints, no signs of forced entry, and no evidence of a struggle. The gardener was gone, and so was the masterpiece, leaving behind only the quiet gardens he had tended so carefully and a painting that was a perfect, silent lie. The world looked for a master thief, but the man they were searching for was someone who had simply mastered the art of being patient. The world of high-stakes theft often conjures images of sparkling diamonds or stacks of cold, hard currency, but in the quiet, wooded expanses of Quebec, treasure takes a different, more amber-hued form. To understand the gravity of what occurred in the quiet months between 2011 and 2012, one must first understand the rhythm of the Canadian wilderness. Here, the maples stand as silent sentinels, their branches skeletal against the winter sky, waiting for the precise moment when the nights remain frozen and the days begin to thaw. This is the season of the sap, a fleeting window where the lifeblood of the forest is gathered and transformed into what the locals call liquid gold. Because this harvest is so dependent on the whims of nature, the Federation of Quebec Maple Syrup Producers maintains a strategic reserve, a massive, high-security safety net designed to keep the global market steady, even if the trees decide to remain dormant for a year. This reserve was housed in a series of nondescript warehouses, structures of corrugated metal and concrete that sat unremarkable against the backdrop of small-town industrial parks. One such warehouse in St. Louis de Blanford became the stage for a crime so patient and so vast that it almost defies the imagination. Inside, the air was perpetually cool, smelling faintly of wood and ancient sugar. Thousands of white metal barrels were stacked floor to ceiling, reaching up into the dim shadows of the rafters. Each barrel weighed roughly 600 pounds and was worth a small fortune. To the casual observer, it was a fortress of boredom, a place where time stood still, guarded more by the sheer weight of the inventory than by any complex system of lasers or armed guards. The heist did not begin with a shattered window or a tripped alarm. Instead, it began with a slow, rhythmic exchange that mirrored the very process of the harvest itself. A group of individuals, who understood the logistical flow of the syrup industry better than most, realized that the warehouse was rarely inspected with any degree of scrutiny. The barrels were counted, yes, but they were rarely opened. And so, under the cover of the mundane, they began a process of siphoning. They didn't take the barrels, not at first. Instead, they brought in empty containers, parked their trucks in the quiet shadows of the loading docks, and moved with a practiced, industrial efficiency. Imagine the sound of the warehouse at night, the distant hum of a refrigeration unit, the soft whistle of wind through the metal siding, and the steady, liquid glug of syrup being transferred from a Federation barrel into a thief's reservoir. To maintain the illusion of weight, they filled the original barrels with water. It was a perfect, silent substitution. A barrel of water feels much like a barrel of syrup when shifted by a forklift. It occupies the same space, presents the same silhouette, and offers the same resistance to a wandering hand. For months, the thieves returned again and again, peeling back the layers of the reserve like an onion. They moved with the seasons, unhurried, blending into the background of the region's heavy transport culture. As the months turned into a year, the scale of the operation grew. They moved from siphoning to simply hauling away entire truckloads of barrels, replacing them with empty ones to keep the stacks looking uniform. The stolen syrup was transported to sugar shacks deep in the woods, quiet, steam-filled cabins where the legitimate harvest was usually processed. There, the stolen goods were mixed with legal syrup, effectively laundering the liquid gold until its origins were completely obscured. From these remote outposts, the syrup was shipped across borders and into the kitchens of unsuspecting families across North America, a silent passenger in the global supply chain. The sheer audacity of the crime lay in its invisibility. The thieves weren't just stealing a product. They were stealing time. They relied on the fact that the reserve was a stagnant entity, a resource meant to be sat upon rather than moved. In the silence of the St. Louis de Blanford warehouse, nearly 10,000 barrels were eventually compromised. That represents nearly $30 million of syrup, roughly 10% of the entire global supply, vanishing without a single alarm being raised. It was a heist of ghosts, carried out by people who knew how to blend into the landscape of their own daily lives. The discovery was as quiet as the crime itself. During a routine inventory check, an inspector was climbing the stacks of barrels. He happened to lean his weight against one of the metal drums, expecting the solid, unyielding resistance of 600 pounds of viscous sugar. Instead, the barrel wobbled. It felt light, almost buoyant. When he tapped the side of the metal, it didn't give the deep, dull thud of a full container. It rang out with a hollow, metallic chime. Confused, he opened the bung of the barrel and tipped it slightly. Out poured clear, odorless water. He moved to the next barrel, and then the next. The realization began to spread through the warehouse like a cold draft. The strategic reserve, the pride of the provincial industry, had been hollowed out from the inside. The investigation that followed was a painstaking process of tracing the movement of heavy machinery and looking for discrepancies in the ledgers of independent distributors. Because the crime had been so slow and so methodical, there was no single crime scene to process. The evidence was scattered across hundreds of miles of backroads and hidden in the steam of a dozen different sugar shacks. It was a crime of the community, involving truck drivers, warehouse workers, and family farmers who had succumbed to the temptation of a payout that seemed too easy to pass up. Eventually, the ringleaders were identified, men who had used their intimate knowledge of the syrup trade to exploit a system built on trust and the assumption of professional honor. Yet, even as the arrests were made and the legal proceedings began, a significant portion of the syrup was never recovered. It had already been consumed, drizzled over pancakes and stirred into coffee, a sweet, stolen piece of the Canadian wilderness that had simply dissolved into the world. The warehouses are now more heavily guarded, the inspections more frequent, and the barrels checked with a more cynical eye. But the memory of the great Canadian maple syrup heist remains a testament to the idea that some of the most significant crimes don't require masks or weapons. Sometimes, all they require is a quiet night, a long hose, and the patience to wait for the gold to flow. The forest remains quiet now, the maples still standing in their rows, their secrets kept behind bark and frost, while the memory of the vanished millions lingers like the faint, sweet scent of sugar on a winter breeze. In the grand tapestry of human perception, there exists a curious phenomenon where the most visible objects in our lives can, through their sheer permanence, become almost invisible. We accept their presence as fundamental truths, as unchangeable as the horizon or the pull of the tides. In the spring of 1925, the city of Paris was a place of rapid transformation, a metropolis shaking off the dust of the Great War and stepping into a new age of jazz, art, and architectural ambition. Yet, towering above the cobblestones and the winding Seine was a structure that many Parisians had come to view with a mixture of weary familiarity and outright disdain: the Eiffel Tower. Originally constructed as a temporary centerpiece for the 1889 World's Fair, it had far outlasted its 20-year permit. By the mid-20s, the iron giant was showing its age. Rust bloomed like dark flowers along its latticework, and the cost of repainting its sprawling surface was a constant, nagging drain on the city's treasury. It was against this backdrop of municipal frustration that a man named Victor Lustig arrived in the city. Lustig was a man who moved through the world with the grace of a shadow and the effortless charm of a diplomat. He was a linguist, a student of human nature, and a master of the soft sell. He did not look like a criminal. He looked like the sort of man who owned several successful businesses and spent his winters on the Riviera. He checked into the Hotel de Crillon, one of the most prestigious addresses in Paris, a place where the curtains were made of heavy silk and the air smelled of expensive tobacco and floor wax. It was here, in the quiet luxury of his suite, that Lustig read a newspaper article detailing the many problems facing the Eiffel Tower. The article mentioned that public opinion was turning against the monument, with some even calling for its complete removal. To Lustig, this wasn't just news, it was an invitation. With the patience of a master craftsman, Lustig set about creating a persona. He didn't want to be a businessman, he wanted to be a bureaucrat. There is a specific kind of power held by the weary, mid-level government official, the person who handles the difficult, unglamorous tasks of the state. He commissioned a set of high-quality stationery, embossed with the official seal of the Ministry of Post and Telegraphs. He then sent out a series of urgent, confidential invitations to the top scrap metal dealers in the city. The letters were masterpieces of understated tension, hinting at a project of immense scale and national importance that required the utmost discretion. The meeting took place in a private dining room at the Crillon. The 5 dealers who arrived were men of industry, used to the grime of the junkyard but eager for the prestige of a government contract. Lustig met them not with a grand presentation, but with a hushed, conspiratorial tone. He spoke of the government's secret decision to dismantle the Eiffel Tower. He lamented the necessity of the act, speaking of the tower's beauty while simultaneously pointing out its structural failings and the astronomical cost of its upkeep. He played on their patriotism and their greed in equal measure. He told them that the iron alone, 7,000 tons of it, would be a windfall for whichever firm was selected to handle the demolition. Among the dealers was a man named André Poisson. Poisson was a man who felt he was on the outside looking in. He had wealth, but he lacked the social standing of the old Parisian elite. He was anxious, ambitious, and deeply susceptible to the idea of a big break that would cement his legacy. Lustig, observing the room with the keen eye of a predator, identified Poisson as his mark almost instantly. He noticed the way Poisson leaned forward when the word exclusive was used, and the way he checked his gold pocket watch with a nervous, repetitive motion. To further the illusion, Lustig arranged for a tour of the tower. He ushered the men into a fleet of black limousines and drove them to the Champ de Mars. There, they were met by a security official, an accomplice of Lustig's, who moved them past the barriers with a practiced flick of a badge. As they stood at the base of the tower, looking up into the dizzying geometry of the iron beams, Lustig pointed out the patches of corrosion and the peeling paint. He spoke of the logistical nightmare of the dismantling process, making it sound like a burden he was personally carrying for the sake of the Republic. By the time the tour was over, Poisson was convinced. He didn't just want the contract, he felt he needed it. However, a con of this magnitude requires a final, psychological anchor. Poisson's wife was skeptical. She wondered why such a massive deal was being handled in a hotel room rather than a government office. When Poisson voiced these concerns to Lustig during their next meeting, Lustig didn't panic. Instead, he leaned in closer and lowered his voice even further. He sighed, the sound of a man exhausted by the corruption of his peers. He confessed to Poisson that his life as a government official was difficult, that his salary was meager, and that he often struggled to maintain the lifestyle his position required. It was a brilliant move. By soliciting a bribe, Lustig transformed himself from a suspicious official into a relatable, albeit dishonest, bureaucrat. To Poisson, a bribe was a language he understood perfectly. It was the proof that the deal was real, because in his experience, nothing of value in the government happened without a little grease on the wheels. The exchange was a quiet affair. Poisson arrived at the hotel with 2 checks, one for the purchase of the tower and a second, substantial one as a personal gift to Lustig to ensure his bid was chosen. Lustig accepted the envelopes with a dignified nod, as if he were performing a distasteful but necessary duty. He handed Poisson a folder of official documents, heavily stamped and signed, and thanked him for his service to the state. The two men shook hands in the golden light of the afternoon, one believing he had just secured the greatest business deal in French history, the other knowing he had exactly 1 hour to reach the train station. Lustig did not stay to watch the fallout. Within the hour, he was on a train headed for Vienna, the checks tucked safely into his breast pocket. He waited for the news to break. He expected a national scandal, a hunt for the man who had sold the soul of Paris. But as the days turned into weeks, the newspapers remained silent. André Poisson, upon discovering he had been swindled, was so overcome with shame and the fear of becoming the laughingstock of the Parisian business world that he never went to the police. He simply absorbed the loss, a silent victim of his own ambition. Lustig was so emboldened by this silence that, months later, he returned to Paris to try the exact same con on a different group of dealers. This time, however, the Mark was less concerned with his reputation and more concerned with his bank account. The police were notified, and Lustig was forced to flee the country for good, eventually finding his way to America where his career in deception would continue in even more elaborate forms. But the story of the man who sold the Eiffel Tower remains a perfect illustration of the power of the quiet con. It reminds us that we often see only what we expect to see, and that the most audacious thefts are not those that happen in the dark, but those that happen in broad daylight, targeting the things we think are too big, too permanent, and too famous to ever be lost. The tower still stands today, its iron gleaming under the Parisian sun, a monument to history, but also a silent witness to the time it was sold for the price of a bribe and a few sheets of elegant stationery. While the streets of Paris eventually reclaimed their sense of security, the vast, rain-swept skies of the Pacific Northwest became the setting for a mystery that would remain suspended in the air for decades. It was the afternoon of November 24, 1971, a day characterized by the kind of heavy, charcoal-colored clouds that often settle over the city of Portland as winter approaches. At the airport, the atmosphere was one of pre-holiday bustle, though the security measures of the time were a world away from the rigorous checks of the modern era. People moved through the terminals with a sense of casual ease, carrying their coats and leather satchels, their identities largely unverified and their luggage often uninspected. Among this crowd was a man who called himself Dan Cooper. He was a person of unremarkable appearance, a man who seemed to have stepped out of a business meeting or a quiet office. He wore a dark suit, a crisp white shirt with a narrow black tie, and a lightweight raincoat to ward off the drizzling Oregon mist. He walked to the Northwest Orient Airlines counter and, using cash, purchased a one-way ticket for Flight 305, a short 30-minute hop to Seattle. The transaction was simple, forgotten as soon as it was completed by the clerk behind the desk. Cooper boarded the Boeing 727 with a calm, steady gait, taking his seat in 18C, located in the rear of the cabin. To the other passengers, he was just another businessman traveling for work, perhaps eager to get home for the Thanksgiving holiday. He sat quietly, placing his black attaché case on the floor and staring out of the window at the rain streaking against the glass. Once the plane was airborne and the no smoking sign flickered off, he lit a cigarette and ordered a bourbon and soda. His movements were precise and unhurried, the actions of a man who was comfortable in his own skin and deeply familiar with the environment around him. The calm of the flight was broken not by a shout or a struggle, but by a small, handwritten note passed to a flight attendant named Florence Schaffner. Initially, she tucked the paper into her pocket, assuming it was merely the phone number of a lonely traveler. But Cooper leaned toward her and spoke in a voice that was low, polite, and entirely devoid of malice. He suggested she look at the note, informing her that he had a bomb in his briefcase. When she opened the satchel, she saw a tangle of red cylinders and wires, a sight that was jarringly out of place in the soft-lit, beige interior of the commercial jet. Cooper's demands were as specific as his attire. He wanted $200,000 in negotiable American currency and 4 parachutes. Most importantly, he wanted the plane to be met in Seattle with a fuel truck standing by. The next few hours were a study in controlled tension. While the plane circled Seattle, The authorities on the ground scrambled to meet his demands, and the pilots maintained a facade of normalcy for the sake of the other passengers. Cooper remained in his seat, finishing his drink and engaging in occasional, polite conversation with the crew. He was described as being remarkably kind, even thoughtful, ensuring that the flight attendants were comfortable despite the extraordinary circumstances. He paid his drink tab and even tried to give a tip. There was no grandstanding, no political manifesto, and no erratic behavior. He was a man performing a task, a professional who seemed to view the entire event as a logistical operation rather than a crime. When the plane finally landed at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, the sun had already set, leaving the tarmac a shimmering black under the airport's floodlights. The exchange was handled with the same quiet efficiency. The money and the parachutes were delivered, and in return, Cooper allowed all 36 passengers and 2 of the flight attendants to disembark. He remained on the plane with the flight crew, his briefcase never far from his side. As the jet was refueled, Cooper provided the pilots with very specific instructions for the next leg of the journey. He wanted to fly toward Mexico City, but he insisted on a flight path that remained low, below 10,000 feet, and at a speed that was just above the plane's stalling point. He required the landing gear to remain down and the wing flaps to be set at 15 degrees. Most curiously, he insisted that the cabin remain unpressurized and that the aft stairs, the staircase located at the very rear of the Boeing 727, stay unlocked. The plane took off again into the teeth of a growing storm. The rain had turned into a torrential downpour, and the wind buffeted the heavy aircraft as it climbed into the dark, churning sky. Somewhere between Seattle and Reno, over the rugged, forest-choked wilderness of the Lewis River area, the flight crew noticed a sudden change in air pressure. A warning light on the flight deck flickered, indicating that the aft stairs had been lowered. The pilot asked over the intercom if Cooper needed any assistance, to which the man replied with a single, final word, no. When the plane eventually landed in Reno, the rear stairs were dragging on the runway, sparking against the pavement. The cabin was empty. Dan Cooper, his briefcase, the parachutes, and the $200,000 had vanished into the freezing, midnight air. The search that followed was one of the most extensive and frustrating in the history of American law enforcement. For weeks, soldiers, police, and volunteers combed the dense woods of Washington state, battling through thickets of blackberry bushes and navigating treacherous, mud-slicked ravines. They found nothing. No body, no clothing, no discarded parachutes. It was as if Cooper had simply dissolved into the mist. Theories began to circulate immediately. Some believed he couldn't have survived the jump, a plunge into a winter storm, wearing only a business suit and loafers, into a wilderness that was unforgiving even to experienced woodsmen. Others argued that his specific knowledge of the Boeing 727 and his calm demeanor suggested he was a man with a military background, perhaps a paratrooper who knew exactly how to navigate the risks. The mystery deepened in 1980, when a young boy named Brian Ingram was playing on the banks of the Columbia River at a place called Tina Bar. As he dug into the sand to build a campfire, he uncovered 3 bundles of cash, totaling nearly $6,000. The bills were heavily weathered, their edges frayed and gray, but the serial numbers matched the money given to Cooper nearly a decade earlier. This find provided the only physical evidence ever recovered, yet it raised more questions than it answered. Why was the money there, miles away from the suspected jump zone? Had it washed down the river, or had it been buried there by Cooper himself? If he had survived, why leave behind a portion of his prize? As the years stretched into decades, the case of D.B. Cooper, a name created by a journalistic error that stuck in the public consciousness, became a piece of modern folklore. The FBI processed thousands of leads and investigated hundreds of suspects, but the man in the dark suit remained a phantom. He became a symbol of the ultimate escape, a figure who walked out of the mundane world and into the realm of the unknown. The Boeing 727 was eventually modified with a device known as a Cooper vane, a small wedge of metal that prevents the aft stairs from being opened during flight, ensuring that such a departure could never happen again. But the sky over the Pacific Northwest remains a quiet witness to that November night. A vast, dark expanse where a polite man once stepped into the void and left the world wondering where he landed. The trees in the valley continue to grow, their roots wrapping around the secrets of the forest floor, while the story of the silent departure continues to float, untethered and unresolved, in the quiet corners of our imagination. In the hallowed, dust-moted air of the world's great libraries, there is a specific kind of silence, a heavy, reverent stillness that seems to emanate from the millions of pages pressing against one another. To most, these buildings are cathedrals of shared knowledge, but to a man named Stephen Bloomberg, they were something far more personal. Bloomberg was not a man driven by the common motivations of the criminal world. He had no interest in the fast cars, the glittering jewelry, or the lavish lifestyles that typically fuel a life of theft. He was a man of quiet, almost spectral presence, possessed by a singular, consuming passion that bordered on the spiritual. He didn't want to destroy history, nor did he want to profit from it. He simply wanted to possess it, to surround himself with the physical weight of the past until the modern world outside his door ceased to exist. Bloomberg's journey into the shadows of the literary world began in the late 1960s and spanned over 20 years. He was a bibliomaniac in the truest, most literal sense of the word. His target was not just any book, but the rare, the ancient, and the irreplaceable, incunabula from the dawn of the printing press, hand-colored maps of territories that no longer existed, and diaries of pioneers whose handwriting was the only surviving trace of their lives. He moved across the United States like a ghost, visiting over 140 universities and museums in 45 states. His method was a study in patience and low-impact infiltration. He was a master of the long game, often spending days or even weeks scouting a location, learning the shift changes of the evening janitors, and identifying the structural weaknesses of old buildings. He did not use glass cutters or high-tech gadgetry. Instead, Bloomberg relied on the fact that libraries, by their very nature, are designed to be accessible. He would often hide in closets or crawl spaces, waiting for the heavy oak doors to be locked for the night. Once the lights were dimmed and the staff had gone home, he would emerge into the darkness, guided by a small flashlight. He became an expert at navigating ventilation shafts and elevator top hats. In one famous instance, he reportedly scaled a dumbwaiter shaft to reach a restricted collection that was deemed inaccessible from the main floor. He treated the books with a tenderness that was almost obsessive, carefully sliding them from their shelves and replacing them with dummies, or simply shifting the remaining volumes so that the gap was invisible to the casual eye. What made Bloomberg truly unique was his total lack of interest in the market value of his haul. Most rare book thieves are caught when they attempt to sell their stolen goods to dealers or at auction houses, but Bloomberg never made that move. He wasn't a seller. He was a collector who refused to acknowledge the concept of public ownership. He transported his treasures back to his home in Ottumwa, Iowa, a large, rambling Victorian house that became a fortress of paper and ink. Inside, the walls were lined with custom-built shelves that eventually groaned under the weight of over 23,600 volumes. The collection included a 1493 edition of the Nuremberg Chronicle and original letters from the era of the American Revolution. He lived among them in a state of quiet, scholarly reclusion, meticulously cataloging every item with the precision of a professional librarian. To Bloomberg, he wasn't a thief. He was a self-appointed conservator. In his mind, he was rescuing these items from the neglect of public institutions where they might be handled by careless students or lost in the bureaucracy of large archives. He kept his home at a specific temperature and humidity to preserve the vellum and calfskin. He spent his nights reading by candlelight, immersed in the thoughts of people who had been dead for centuries. His life was a silent, solitary loop of acquisition and preservation, a world where the only voices he heard were the ones printed on the pages he had liberated. He was a man who had built a private universe out of stolen fragments, a labyrinth of words where he was the only inhabitant. The scale of his collection was so vast that it eventually became its own undoing. No man can move 20 tons of rare books across the country without leaving some kind of trail, however faint. The break in the case came not from a brilliant piece of detective work, but from a betrayal within his very small circle of acquaintances. A friend, motivated by the promise of a reward, led the authorities to the house in Iowa. When the FBI arrived with a search warrant, they were staggered by what they found. It wasn't just a few stolen books. It was a library that rivaled the special collections of major universities. The agents had to bring in a fleet of tractor-trailers and a team of professional librarians to safely remove and catalog the items. It took weeks to empty the house, a process that felt, to the grieving Bloomberg, like the dismantling of his very soul. The legal proceedings that followed were as unusual as the crime itself. Bloomberg's defense centered on his mental state, the idea that his obsession was an irresistible impulse, a form of collection mania that superseded his understanding of the law. Experts testified about the strange, lonely world he had inhabited, where the books were more real than the people around him. He was eventually convicted and served a relatively short prison sentence, but he remained a figure of fascination within the bibliophile community. He hadn't destroyed the books. In fact, many of them were returned to their home institutions in better condition than when they had been taken, thanks to his careful storage. The legacy of the book thief of Ottumwa changed the way libraries view security. Gone are the days when a quiet scholar could be left alone in the stacks with a leather-bound treasure for hours on end. The theft forced institutions to implement more rigorous background checks for researchers, to install more sophisticated motion sensors, and to realize that the greatest threat to their collections might not be a professional criminal looking for a payday, but a quiet, unassuming man with an infinite amount of patience and a deep, tragic love for the written word. Today, those books sit once again on their proper shelves in Harvard, Yale, and the Library of Congress, their pages holding the stories of the past, but also the silent, invisible history of the decades they spent in a dark house in Iowa, being read by a man who thought they belonged only to him. The silence of the library remains, but it is now a guarded silence, a reminder that passion, when left unchecked, can become its own kind of prison. The Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston is a place designed to evoke the atmosphere of a 15th-century Venetian palazzo. It is a sanctuary of beauty, where flowering vines trail down from stone balconies into a central courtyard filled with the scent of jasmine and the soft sound of trickling water. Mrs. Gardner, a woman of singular vision, had decreed in her will that the arrangement of her collection must never be altered. Every painting, every piece of furniture, and every ancient sculpture was to remain exactly where she had placed it. This sense of frozen time created a unique vulnerability. On the night of March 18, 1990, the city was still vibrating with the lingering energy of St. Patrick's Day celebrations. But inside the museum, the air was still and the corridors were cloaked in the deep shadows of the early morning hours. Two young security guards were on duty, moving through the galleries with flashlights that cut narrow paths through the darkness. Their footsteps echoed on the stone floors, a rhythmic reminder of the museum's solitude. At approximately 1:24 a.m., a buzzer sounded at the side entrance on Palace Road. When the guard at the desk looked at the closed-circuit monitor, he saw two men dressed in police uniforms, complete with badges and hats pulled low over their eyes. Through the intercom, they claimed they were responding to a report of a disturbance within the museum grounds. In a moment of fateful hesitation, the guard decided to bypass protocol and allowed them through the secure door. It was a choice born of the natural trust one affords to a uniform, a trust that would lead to the most significant art heist in history. Once inside, the tone shifted instantly. The officers did not ask questions about a disturbance. Instead, they ordered the guard to step away from the desk and face the wall. Within minutes, both guards were bound with duct tape and handcuffed to pipes in the basement, their eyes covered and their voices muffled. The thieves were now alone in the Palace of Shadows, with 81 minutes of uninterrupted access to some of the world's most precious treasures. They moved with a strange mixture of purpose and clumsiness, as if they knew exactly what they wanted but had no understanding of how to handle the objects themselves. They bypassed many of the most valuable pieces in the collection, including a world-famous Raphael, to focus on a very specific list of targets. In the Dutch room, the thieves bypassed the motion sensors by moving with a slow, deliberate pace that the technology of 1990 failed to register. They approached Rembrandt's only known seascape, the storm on the Sea of Galilee. In a move that would haunt art lovers for generations, they did not carefully remove the painting from its frame. Instead, they used a sharp blade to cut the canvas directly from its wooden stretcher, leaving the jagged edges of the masterpiece behind. They did the same with Rembrandt's A Lady and Gentleman in Black and A Delicate Landscape by Govert Flinck. The sound of tearing canvas must have been a jarring, violent intrusion into the museum's sacred silence. They then moved toward a small, unassuming work by Johannes Vermeer called The Concert. Vermeer's paintings are incredibly rare, with only 34 known to exist in the world, and this particular piece was considered one of the jewels of the Gardner collection. Again, they pulled it from the wall and prepared it for transport. As they worked, they also snatched a series of Degas sketches and a bronze Napoleonic eagle from the top of a silk flag. The selection seemed erratic, a blend of world-class masterpieces and items of relatively minor value. They even took a small, self-portrait etching by Rembrandt that was no larger than a postage stamp. Before leaving, the thieves made 2 separate trips to their vehicle, carrying the rolled-up canvases out into the cool Boston night. At 2:45 a.m., they checked on the guards in the basement, told them they would be hearing from their superiors, and vanished into the city. The crime was not discovered until the morning shift arrived, finding the museum's doors locked but the frames in the Dutch room hanging empty. The sight was surreal. Thick, ornate frames of gold and dark wood still perched on the walls, framing only the floral wallpaper and the void where the art had once been. It looked as if the paintings had simply evaporated, leaving behind a hollow memory of their presence. The FBI investigation that followed would span decades and continents. Every lead was pursued, from the gritty underworld of the Boston mob to the high-end galleries of Europe and Asia. Theories emerged about trophy collectors who wanted the paintings for their private bunkers, or criminals who intended to use the art as a get-out-of-jail-free card in future negotiations with the government. Despite a $10 million reward and thousands of interviews, not a single one of the 13 stolen items has ever been recovered. The trail of the 2 men in the police uniforms seemed to end at the museum's threshold, disappearing into the mist of the Atlantic. Today, the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum remains open to the public, and Mrs. Gardner's will is still honored with strict devotion. If you walk into the Dutch room today, you will see the empty frames still hanging in their original positions. They serve as a poignant and haunting memorial to the lost works. The museum staff refuses to fill the gaps, believing that the absence of the art is a powerful statement in itself, a reminder of the fragility of culture and the enduring nature of mystery. The empty frames act as windows into a night when the world's heritage was treated as mere cargo. In the quiet of the gallery, visitors often stand before these hollow rectangles in a state of reverent grief, realizing that the greatest crime was not the theft of property, but the theft of the opportunity for the world to witness beauty. The mystery of the Gardner heist remains a silent, open wound in the heart of the art world, a story that continues to glide forward through time, waiting for an ending that may never come. The pursuit of hidden wealth often leads to the most unlikely of places, where the earth itself becomes an accomplice in a grand design. In the quiet, unassuming suburb of Fortaleza, Brazil, the Bank of Brazil operated a regional branch that seemed entirely ordinary. It was a concrete structure in a neighborhood of modest homes and narrow, tree-lined streets, a place where life moved at the pace of a neighborhood cafe. Yet, beneath this veneer of suburban normalcy, a group of individuals was engaged in a project of staggering ambition. They did not aim to break the bank's doors or bypass its alarms. They aimed to hollow out the earth itself, treating the ground beneath the city as a private highway. The project began months before the event, in a rented house located just 1 block away from the bank's vault. The house was ostensibly a lawn maintenance supply business, a cover that allowed the thieves to come and go with trucks, wheelbarrows, and shovels without drawing the suspicion of the neighbors. The sound of digging, which might have raised alarms in a more sensitive environment, was easily masked by the daily hum of the neighborhood, the rattle of delivery vans, the drone of lawnmowers, and the distant chatter of the city. The thieves worked in rotating shifts, laboring in the cramped, humid darkness of a tunnel that eventually spanned nearly 250 feet. This was not a simple, straight-line dig. It was a masterpiece of subterranean engineering. The tunnel was reinforced with wood and plastic sheeting to prevent collapse, and the air was kept breathable by a rudimentary, yet effective, ventilation system of fans and pipes that siphoned fresh air from the surface. The workers moved with the steady, unglamorous dedication of miners, digging through the dense clay and stone, guided by nothing more than maps of the city's underground utility lines and a deep, intuitive sense of direction. They knew that if they missed their target by even a few meters, the entire effort would be wasted. They had to strike the floor of the vault with precision, a goal that required them to navigate beneath roads, power lines, and sewage pipes that crisscrossed the city's foundation. Inside the bank, the vault sat in a state of tranquil, heavy silence. It was a space designed to hold immense value, protected by thick walls and high-tech sensors that monitored for heat, vibration, and unauthorized movement. But these systems were designed to look outward, to detect an intrusion from the lobby or the street. They were never calibrated to detect a challenge from below, where the earth provided a natural buffer of insulation. The thieves knew the limitations of the bank's security architecture better than the architects did. They waited for a weekend, a period of quiet when the city slowed down and the bank's operations were paused, leaving the vault to sit as a silent, monolithic tomb of cash. The final stretch of the tunnel was the most tense. As they approached the underside of the bank, the workers had to be exceptionally careful to avoid creating vibrations that would trigger the seismic sensors. They discarded their heavy tools for small, handheld instruments, carefully picking away at the final layer of concrete until they felt the cold, unyielding resistance of the vault's floor. It was a process of slow, agonizing removal, a matter of millimeters at a time. The silence of the dig was broken only by the sound of their own rhythmic breathing and the soft, crunching sound of the earth being cleared away. When they finally breached the concrete, the reward for their months of labor was revealed. They pushed upward into the vault, a space that smelled of dry paper and cold metal. Before them lay a sea of Brazilian real notes, a physical manifestation of wealth that had been stored away, out of circulation and out of sight. They didn't panic. They didn't rush. They filled their bags with a methodical, almost professional focus, moving in a practiced rhythm that they had rehearsed in their minds 1,000 times. They took only what they could carry through the narrow, dark artery they had built, leaving behind the heavy coins and the less portable assets. It was an extraction of liquid wealth, a quiet harvest that lasted for hours under the cover of a Sunday morning. The escape was just as disciplined as the entry. They moved back through the tunnel, filling it with debris as they went, and emerged in the rented house, where they changed their clothes, packed their equipment, and simply walked out the door. When the bank employees arrived on Monday morning, they found the vault empty, but the exterior of the building remained completely intact. There were no shattered windows, no drilled locks, and no signs of an intruder having ever crossed the threshold. It was a puzzle that left the authorities baffled, a heist that seemed to have been performed by ghosts who had walked through walls. The investigation that followed was a global endeavor, spanning multiple countries as the suspects scattered to the wind. Much of the money was never recovered, having been laundered through complex networks of businesses and personal accounts before the police even realized the extent of the theft. The tunnel itself was eventually filled with concrete, burying the physical proof of the crime forever. Today, the street where the lawn maintenance house once stood is quiet once again, a place where people walk their dogs and catch the bus to work, never knowing that beneath their feet lies the path of one of the most audacious, patient, and quietest heists in history. The bank still operates, but its security now includes a deep, watchful eye on the foundation, a reminder that in the world of the unexpected, the most dangerous path is often the one we never think to look at, hidden silently beneath the mundane surface of our daily lives. The Louvre in Paris is a labyrinth of history, a palace so vast that its limestone corridors seem to stretch into the very fabric of the past. In the early years of the 20th century, before it became the high-security fortress we know today, the museum was a place of a more relaxed, almost academic atmosphere. Artists were permitted to set up easels in front of the masterpieces, and the security staff consisted largely of aging veterans who viewed their roles as more ceremonial than protective. Among the thousands of treasures housed within its walls, a small portrait on a poplar wood panel hung in the salon car. At the time, Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa was respected by critics, but she had not yet become the global icon of mystery and obsession that she is today. She was simply one face among many, her famous smile flickering in the dim light of a gallery that housed much larger and more dramatic works. On a quiet Sunday evening in August 1911, the museum prepared for its weekly closure. As the last of the tourists filtered out into the warm Parisian twilight, a man named Vincenzo Peruggia remained behind. Peruggia was an Italian immigrant and a glazier who had been hired by the museum to help install protective glass over some of its most precious paintings. He was a man of small stature and quiet intensity, a worker who was intimately familiar with the museum's hidden corners and the predictable habits of its staff. He didn't have a complex plan involving getaway drivers or forged documents. He had only a white smock, a deep sense of nationalistic pride, and the invisibility that comes with being a member of the maintenance crew. Perugia spent the night hidden inside a small, cramped broom closet, surrounded by the scent of pine oil and the dust of 1,000 cleanings. He waited in the total darkness, listening to the rhythmic, hollow footsteps of the night guards as they made their rounds. He knew that on Mondays, the museum was closed to the public for maintenance, a day when the galleries were filled with workers just like him. As the sun began to rise, casting long, pale fingers of light through the high windows of the salon car, Perugia emerged from his hiding place. He wore his white worker's smock, the universal uniform of the unseen. He walked directly to the Mona Lisa, lifted her from the 4 silver pegs that held her to the wall, and carried her into a nearby service stairwell. In the relative safety of the stairs, Perugia performed a task that would seem unthinkable today. He removed the painting from its heavy, ornate frame and its protective glass case. He took the wooden panel, measuring only 30 inches by 21 inches, and wrapped it in his smock, tucking the bundle under his arm. He then attempted to exit the stairwell, only to find the door locked. For a few tense moments, he worked on the doorknob with a screwdriver, even removing the handle entirely before a passing plumber. Assuming Perugia was a fellow workman having trouble with a stubborn lock, opened the door for him with a friendly nod. Perugia simply walked out of the Louvre's main entrance, the world's most famous face hidden beneath a dirty work shirt, and disappeared into the morning bustle of the Rue de Rivoli. The theft was so unexpected that the museum staff didn't even notice the painting was missing for over 24 hours. When an artist arrived on Tuesday morning to sketch in the salon car, he found only 4 empty pegs and a rectangular patch of dust on the wall. He asked a guard where the painting might be, and the guard casually replied that it was likely at the photographer's studio being documented. It wasn't until the end of the day, when the photography department confirmed they didn't have it, that the alarm was finally raised. The news hit Paris like a thunderclap. The Louvre was closed for an entire week, the borders of France were monitored, and the police interviewed every employee, including Perugia. Because he was a former worker with a clean record, and because his alibi seemed plausible, they dismissed him as a suspect, never realizing that the painting was sitting in a trunk in his modest boarding house apartment just a few miles away. For 2 years, the Mona Lisa lived in the shadows. Perugia kept the panel hidden in the false bottom of a trunk, occasionally taking it out to look at it, but mostly letting it gather dust in his cramped quarters. During this time, the theft did something that centuries of display could not. It made the Mona Lisa a global celebrity. Her absence was felt more keenly than her presence had ever been. Thousands of people queued up at the Louvre just to see the empty space where she had once hung. The image of the painting was splashed across every newspaper in the world, and her smile became a symbol of the unattainable. Perugia's motivation was not financial gain, but a misplaced sense of Italian patriotism. He believed that the painting had been stolen from Italy by Napoleon and that he was merely returning a national treasure to its rightful home. In 1913, he finally made his move. He traveled by train to Florence, the city of Leonardo's birth, with the trunk in tow. He contacted an art dealer named Alfredo Geri, offering to return the masterpiece to Italy in exchange for a modest administrative fee. When Geri and the director of the Uffizi Gallery met Perugia in his hotel room and saw the original Mona Lisa emerge from beneath a pile of old shoes and dirty laundry, they were stunned into silence. They took the painting for authentication and promptly called the police. Perugia was arrested without a struggle. His trial was a sensation, but his sentence was remarkably light, only a few months in prison, partly because the Italian public viewed him as a misguided hero rather than a common thief. The Mona Lisa was toured through Italy to massive crowds before being returned to France with a diplomatic flourish. The crime had transformed a quiet portrait into a legend, an icon that would forever be protected by bulletproof glass and sophisticated sensors. Today, millions of people stand before her in a room built specifically to manage her fame. They look into her eyes, searching for the secret of her smile, unaware that the most interesting chapter of her long life was the time she spent tucked under a gardener's smock, walking out of a broom closet and into the quiet streets of Paris, a masterpiece that had become a ghost in its own house. The history of currency is usually written in the language of economics, but the history of rare coins is written in the language of obsession. In 1933, the United States government made a profound shift in its monetary policy, effectively ending the gold standard for its citizens. As part of this transition, the government ordered the destruction of nearly every gold $20 piece minted that year. These coins, known as double eagles, were supposed to be melted down into featureless ingots, their intricate designs and the portrait of liberty erased from existence to satisfy the new fiscal order. Yet, in the quiet chaos of the Great Depression, a small handful of these coins vanished from the mint, smuggled out by individuals who saw not just gold, but a piece of history that refused to be silenced. For decades, the existence of a 1933 double eagle was a ghost story whispered in the halls of numismatic societies. The government maintained that any such coin in private hands was stolen property, subject to immediate seizure. Then, in the late 1990s, a story emerged that centered on a coin with a pedigree that felt like a thriller novel. It had been part of the private collection of King Farouk of Egypt, a man known for his insatiable appetite for the rare and the beautiful. When the king's collection was put up for auction following the revolution in Egypt, the coin vanished again, slipping through the fingers of governments and collectors alike. It became the holy grail of the coin world, a piece of gold that shouldn't exist, a legal paradox that haunted the dreams of the world's most dedicated treasure hunters. The story of how this specific coin surfaced in the modern era is a testament to the power of the long game. It was a journey that took it from the vaults of the US Mint to the private palaces of a Middle Eastern monarch, and finally, to a high-stakes, clandestine meeting in a hotel room in New York City. The man who held it was a British coin dealer who had spent years tracking its movements, moving through a web of international contacts and shadowy middlemen. When he finally brought the coin to the United States to have it authenticated, he was met not by a celebratory reception, but by the cold, efficient hand of the Secret Service. The ensuing legal battle was not about the value of the gold, but about the very definition of ownership. The government argued that the coin was government property, stolen from the mint during a time of national crisis. The dealer, however, argued that because it had once been legally owned by a sovereign head of state, the rules had fundamentally changed. It was a standoff between the power of the state and the tenacity of the private collector. For years, the coin sat in a government vault, a silent, locked-up piece of history that was neither circulation currency nor a legal collectible. It was a prisoner of the law, waiting for a resolution that seemed impossible to reach. What makes this incident so compelling is the sheer resilience of the object itself. Through wars, revolutions, and the shifting tides of international policy, the 1933 double eagle remained intact. It survived the melting pot, the black market, and the courtroom. Its physical presence was a challenge to the authority that had sought to destroy it. Each time it moved, it carried with it the story of the era it was meant to represent. A time of desperation, transformation, and the final gasp of the Gold Age. It was a coin that had defied the decree of a nation, persisting as a silent witness to a history that many had tried to forget. Eventually, a compromise was reached that stands as one of the most unique outcomes in legal history. The government agreed to release the coin, making it the only 1933 double eagle that could ever be legally owned by a private citizen. In 2002, it was sold at auction for over $7 million, a price that reflected not just the gold it contained, but the extraordinary narrative of its survival. The coin was no longer a symbol of theft or a piece of contraband. It had been transformed into an asset, a piece of legal property that could be displayed and admired. Yet, even with the legal issues resolved, the coin remains an outlier. It is a singular anomaly, a reminder that the systems we create to manage our world, our laws, our banks, and our governments are often challenged by the simple, stubborn survival of the physical object. When the hammer fell at the auction, the coin returned to the silence of a private collection, tucked away in a climate-controlled safe where its future is as carefully managed as its past was chaotic. It sits there today, a heavy, golden disc depicting a striding liberty, holding a torch and an olive branch. To the casual observer, it looks like any other coin, but to those who know its story, it is a monument to the unexpected. The journey of the 1933 Double Eagle reminds us that objects have a life of their own, one that often ignores the boundaries drawn on maps or the proclamations made in legislative halls. It represents the ultimate victory of the individual piece of history over the systemic effort to wipe the slate clean. In the quiet, dimly lit room where it now rests, the coin does not speak of its long, turbulent journey. It simply exists, a golden paradox that managed to escape the furnace of history and find its way into the hands of those who prize the rare above the common. It is a story that glides forward in time, a lesson in how the most persistent of crimes can eventually become the most celebrated of treasures, proving that sometimes, the only way to win against the system is to simply outlast it. The sea is a vast repository of silence, a place where the rules of the land, the borders, the laws, and the logic of society seem to dissolve into the rhythmic pull of the tides. Of all the mysteries that have surfaced from the Atlantic's blue-gray depths, none is as haunting or as meticulously preserved as the story of the Mary Celeste. On a clear December afternoon in 1872, the Dei Gratia, a British brigantine sailing toward Gibraltar, spotted a lone vessel drifting aimlessly about 400 miles east of the Azores. The ship, which was later identified as the Mary Celeste, appeared to be in good working order, its sails slightly torn but still catching the wind, its hull cutting through the water with a steady, if erratic, grace. However, as the crew of the Dei Gratia drew closer, they noticed a profound and chilling lack of activity on the deck. There was no helmsman at the wheel, no lookout in the rigging, and no response to their hail. When the boarding party stepped onto the Mary Celeste's deck, they entered a world that seemed to have been frozen mid-breath. The ship was not a wreck. It was a sanctuary of abandoned life. They found the captain's cabin tidy and undisturbed, with his personal belongings, a rosewood harmonium, a sewing machine, and a child's toy, resting exactly where they should be. In the galley, the remains of a meal were laid out, though the myth of warm food on the plates has been corrected by history to a more mundane, but equally eerie, scene of a well-stocked pantry and a half-eaten breakfast. The crew's quarters were equally perplexing. Their pipes and tobacco remained on the tables, and their waterproof boots sat by their bunks, suggesting that whatever had caused them to leave had been sudden, yet had not prompted them to gather their most essential gear for survival at sea. The most jarring discovery was the missing lifeboat. The Mary Celeste was carrying a cargo of 1,701 barrels of industrial alcohol, and while the cargo was largely intact, 9 of the barrels were found to be empty. The ship's log was still on the captain's desk, with the final entry dated 10 days prior, placing the vessel nearly 500 miles away from its current position. There was no mention of a storm, no hint of a mutiny, and no indication of any technical failure. To the men of the Dei Gratia, it was as if the 10 souls aboard, including Captain Benjamin Briggs, his wife, and their 2-year-old daughter, had simply been plucked from the ship by an invisible hand. The investigation that followed in Gibraltar was a masterclass in bureaucratic frustration. The authorities, unable to fathom a scenario where a seasoned captain would abandon a perfectly seaworthy ship, initially suspected foul play. They looked for bloodstains on the deck, but found only the natural discoloration of the wood and rust. They questioned the crew of the Dei Gratia, suspecting a complex ruse to claim salvage rights, but no evidence of a struggle or a conspiracy could be found. The ship was examined from stem to stern, and while she had taken on a small amount of water in her hold, not uncommon for a merchant vessel, she was by all accounts a dry and safe boat. The mystery of why a man would lower his family and crew into a small lifeboat in the middle of the Atlantic, away from a stable ship, remained an impenetrable wall. Over the century that followed, the Mary Celeste became the ultimate canvas for human imagination. Theories ranged from the plausible to the fantastic. Some suggested a sea monster or a giant squid had swept the crew from the deck, while others pointed to the cargo of alcohol, speculating that the fumes had become so concentrated that the captain feared an imminent explosion and ordered a temporary evacuation that turned into a permanent tragedy. Others spoke of seaquakes or underwater volcanic activity that might have terrified the crew into thinking the ship was sinking. Yet, none of these theories accounted for the fact that the ship remained so orderly, so quiet, and so remarkably intact. The Mary Celeste represents a crime against the natural order of narrative, a story with a beginning and a middle, but no ending. The incident was the disappearance itself, a quiet exit from the stage of history. There were no witnesses to the departure, and no survivors to tell the tale. The sea, in its vast and indifferent nature, kept the truth beneath the waves. The ship was eventually returned to service, but she was haunted by her own reputation, passing through the hands of various owners until she was eventually scuttled off the coast of Haiti. But the physical end of the ship was not the end of the story. The Mary Celeste continues to sail through the quiet corners of our collective memory, a reminder that some of the most profound events in human history occur in total silence. It challenges our need for closure and our desire to find a logical explanation for every shadow. In the story of the ship that sailed without its crew, we find a reflection of our own fragility, the idea that even in our most secure and well-ordered environments, we are only a moment away from the unknown. The personal items found in those cabins, the harmonium, the toys, the unsmoked pipes, serve as a poignant bridge to the people who once called the ship home. They were people of habit and routine, much like us, who stepped into a lifeboat and vanished, leaving behind only the sound of the wind in the sails and the creaking of the wooden hull. Today, when we look out at the horizon, we are reminded of that December day in 1872, and the enduring mystery of a journey that was never completed, a story that remains, like the ship itself, drifting and beautiful and utterly unresolved. The city of Antwerp, Belgium, is often called the diamond capital of the world. Through its narrow streets and fortified offices, nearly 80% of the planet's rough diamonds pass at some point in their journey from the Earth to the ring finger. At the center of this glittering industry is the Antwerp World Diamond Center, and deep beneath its surface lies the Diamond Vault. In the early 2000s, this vault was considered one of the most secure locations on Earth. It was protected by 2 feet of reinforced concrete, a door weighing 3 tons that required a combination of nearly 100 million possible permutations, and a sophisticated network of sensors. There were seismic detectors to pick up the faint vibrations of a drill, infrared heat sensors to detect the presence of a human body, and light sensors that would trigger an alarm the moment the darkness of the vault was interrupted. It was a fortress of absolute silence and absolute shadow. To enter such a place uninvited would seem to require a small army and a fleet of heavy machinery. Yet, in February 2003, a group of 5 individuals led by a man named Leonardo Notarbartolo proved that the most complex systems can be undone by the most basic of human tools: observation and patience. Notarbartolo was not a typical criminal. He was a man of quiet, unassuming charm who moved through the Diamond District for 2 years under the guise of an Italian jewelry dealer. He rented a small office in the building, which granted him a legitimate identification card and a reason to be seen in the hallways. He was a master of the invisible presence, a man who used the mundanity of a daily routine to map the vulnerabilities of a masterpiece of engineering. The heist itself was a study in stillness. On the night of February 15th, the team moved through the building with the precision of clockwork. They didn't disable the security systems with high-tech hacking. They bypassed them with physical ingenuity. To fool the infrared sensors, they used a simple hairspray to coat the lenses, creating a thin, translucent film that effectively blinded the machines to the heat of their bodies. To navigate the vault without triggering the light sensors, they moved in total darkness, guided by the memory of the floor plan they had memorized over months of observation. They used strips of styrofoam to insulate the seismic sensors from the vibrations of their movements, turning the vault into a vacuum of sound where even the drop of a pin would go unregistered. The 3-ton door was defeated not by force, but by a man-in-the-middle tactic. They had surreptitiously filmed the vault's security procedures using a tiny camera hidden in a fire extinguisher, allowing them to duplicate the magnetic key and the combination patterns used by the guards. When the door swung open, it did so with a heavy, silent grace, revealing a room filled with 189 safe deposit boxes. For the next several hours, the team worked in the cool, subterranean air, using a specialized tool to pop the locks of the boxes. They didn't take everything. They were selective, focusing on the high-value loose diamonds and gold that were easiest to transport and hardest to track. As they worked, the city above remained entirely unaware of the extraction taking place beneath its feet. There was no struggle, no shouting, and no sudden alarms. The thieves moved like shadows through a forest, leaving the environment exactly as they found it, except for the missing contents of the boxes. By the time they finished, they had collected nearly $100 million in treasure. They exited the vault, closed the massive door, and walked out of the building just as the first light of dawn was beginning to touch the spires of the Antwerp Cathedral. They had achieved the impossible. They had entered the world's most secure vault and left it without a single sensor being triggered. The discovery was made on Monday morning when the vault's keepers arrived to begin their week. They found the door closed and locked, but when they entered the room, they were met with a scene of surreal emptiness. Safe deposit boxes hung open like metal mouths, their contents vanished. The security logs showed absolutely no record of the door being opened or any motion being detected. It was as if the diamonds had simply dematerialized. The police were baffled, facing a crime scene that offered no fingerprints, no DNA, and no clear point of entry for a physical intruder. The Antwerp Diamond District, a place built on the promise of absolute security, felt a collective shiver of vulnerability. The break in the case came from a mistake that was as quiet and mundane as the crime was spectacular. Notarbartolo and his team had stopped in a wooded area on their way back to Italy to burn their evidence. In his haste, one of the members left behind a small bag of trash containing a half-eaten salami sandwich and a receipt from the Antwerp Diamond Center. A local hunter found the litter and, annoyed by the mess, contacted the police. From that single scrap of paper and the biological traces on the food, the authorities were able to trace the team back to their rented offices and eventually to Italy. Notarbartolo was arrested and sentenced to prison, but the vast majority of the stolen diamonds were never found. They had vanished into the global market, likely cut and polished into new forms that wiped away any trace of their origin. Even after his release, Notarbartolo remained a figure of mystery, often hinting that the heist was part of a much larger, more complex insurance scheme involving the diamond dealers themselves. Whether he was the mastermind of a brilliant theft or a pawn in a larger game, the Antwerp diamond heist remains a landmark in the history of crime. It serves as a reminder that no matter how much technology we pile upon ourselves, the human element, the ability to watch, to wait, and to find the small, silent cracks in the armor, will always be the most potent force. Today, the vault has been upgraded with even more sensors, more cameras, and more guards, but the memory of the night the shadows walked through walls remains a quiet, unsettling legend in the world of the glittering and the rare. The concept of a legacy is often tied to the things we leave behind, the monuments, the families, and the accumulated wealth that acts as a physical marker of our time on Earth. But sometimes, a legacy is defined not by what is present, but by a sudden, inexplicable void. In the quiet, high-walled neighborhoods where the truly wealthy reside, there is a specialized kind of privacy. It is an environment where silence is a commodity and where the movement of millions of dollars is often handled with no more sound than the rustle of a silk curtain or the soft click of a computer mouse. In this world, a reclusive millionaire, whose name was whispered in financial circles but whose face was unknown to his neighbors, built a life of absolute, shimmering isolation. He lived in a sprawling estate that functioned as a self-contained universe, a place of manicured gardens and darkened rooms where the outside world was kept at a comfortable, permanent distance. The millionaire, whom we shall call Mr. Sterling, was a man of precise habits. He did not travel, he did not entertain, and he communicated with his legal and financial teams almost exclusively through encrypted messages and a trusted intermediary. His wealth was not just a number. It was a vast, sprawling architecture of international accounts, real estate holdings, and physical assets that grew silently, year after year, like a forest in the dark. Because he was so reclusive, his absence was not something that was measured in days or weeks. He was a man who could go months without being seen by anyone other than his personal staff, and even then, his presence was often signaled only by a light in a high window or a tray of food left outside a heavy oak door. The mystery began when his primary financial advisor noticed a subtle change in the rhythm of the accounts. For decades, the movement of Sterling's capital had followed a predictable, almost mathematical pattern. Then, without warning, the flow stopped. Invoices went unpaid, scheduled transfers were missed, and the encrypted messages that once arrived with the regularity of a heartbeat ceased entirely. There was no announcement of an illness, no indication of a planned trip, and no sign of a struggle. The estate remained as it always had been, a fortress of tranquility. The iron gates remained locked, The security cameras continued their slow, rhythmic sweeps of the perimeter, and the gardener continued to trim the hedges with a devotion that seemed untethered to the presence of a master. When the legal authorities finally gained entry to the manor, they expected to find a scene of tragedy or perhaps a crime. They moved through the grand hallways, their footsteps muffled by thick Persian rugs, their voices hushed by the sheer weight of the silence. They found the house in a state of perfect, eerie preservation. In the study, a fountain pen sat uncapped on a leather blotter, the ink long since dried into a dark, brittle stain. A book remained open on a side table, its pages yellowed by the sun but otherwise undisturbed. There were no signs of a break-in, no missing valuables, and no evidence of a hasty departure. The millionaire's personal effects, his clothes, his watch, his spectacles, were all exactly where they should have been. It was as if the man had simply reached the end of a sentence and vanished into the margin of the page. The investigation that followed was a descent into a labyrinth of phantom trails. Private investigators and forensic accountants were brought in to trace the missing millions, only to find that the wealth was as elusive as its owner. Sterling had spent his life building a financial system designed to be impenetrable, a web of shell companies and offshore trusts that required a series of dead man switches and biometric keys to access. Without Sterling himself, the money was essentially locked in a digital vault to which the door had been erased. The millions were there, visible on ledgers and balance sheets, but they were effectively non-existent, a theoretical fortune that no one could touch. As the years stretched into a decade, the estate began to succumb to the slow, patient reclamation of nature. Ivy began to crawl over the stone walls, and the once pristine gardens became a wild, tangled thicket. The house became a local legend, a ghost house that sat at the edge of the community like a held breath. Rumors swirled. Had he fled to a private island? Had he been the victim of a perfectly executed, bloodless coup by his own security team? Or had he simply grown so tired of the world that he found a way to step out of it entirely, leaving his fortune behind as a final, ironic joke on those who equate wealth with security? The search for a body yielded nothing. The woods surrounding the estate were combed, the foundations were scanned with ground-penetrating radar, and the local hospitals and morgues were checked for John Doe's. No footprint was ever found. The millionaire had achieved the ultimate privacy. He had disappeared without leaving a single clue as to his fate. His wealth remained unclaimed, a massive pile of gold that served no purpose other than to exist as a memory of a man who was no longer there. The legal battle over the estate lasted for 20 years, a slow-motion collision of distant relatives and government agencies, each trying to claim a piece of a ghost. Today, the manor has been demolished, the land subdivided into modern, unremarkable lots where families live and children play, unaware that they are walking over the site of a profound disappearance. The missing millions were eventually absorbed into the coffers of various states as unclaimed property, a cold, bureaucratic ending to a story of immense individual power. The mystery of Mr. Sterling remains a quiet warning about the nature of isolation. It reminds us that we are defined by our connections to others, and that without those threads, we can simply dissolve, leaving behind nothing but a set of empty rooms and a fortune that has lost its meaning. The wind still blows through the trees where the estate once stood, a soft, whistling sound that carries no answers, only the lingering sense of a presence that was once there and then, in a moment of absolute stillness, was gone. In the quiet, suburban world of a modest garage in a small town, a different kind of alchemy was taking place. While the great museums of the world pride themselves on their ability to authenticate and preserve the past, they are often at the mercy of the human desire to believe in the discovery of a lost masterpiece. The world of art forgery is typically seen as a crime of high-tech chemicals and complex deceptions, but for Sean Greenhalgh, it was a matter of quiet, domestic focus. For nearly 17 years, Greenhalgh lived a dual life. To his neighbors, he was a quiet, unassuming man who lived with his elderly parents in a council house. To the art world, he was the source of some of the most significant historical discoveries of the 20th century, creating a body of work that spanned from ancient Egyptian sculpture to Victorian watercolors. Working from a small shed in his backyard, Greenhalgh operated with a level of patience that would have made a monk envious. He didn't use modern tools or mass-produced pigments. Instead, he studied the chemistry of antiquity. He sourced old stone from demolition sites and used tea bags to stain paper, giving it the brittle, amber hue of a century's passing. He didn't just copy known works, he created newly discovered pieces by forgotten masters, filling in the gaps of art history with his own imagination. His most famous creation was the Amana Princess, a small alabaster statue that he claimed was over 3,000 years old. To create it, he used basic masonry tools and then aged the stone by burying it in the garden and applying a mixture of dirt and chemicals that mimicked the patina of 3 millennia in the Egyptian sand. The brilliance of the Greenhalgh operation was not just in the art, but in the provenance. A forgery is only as good as the story behind it, and Sean's father, George, acted as the face of the operation. George was a charming, elderly man who would approach museums with a humble tale of an item that had been in the family for generations, a forgotten heirloom tucked away in a trunk or purchased at a local estate sale decades ago. Curators, driven by the thrill of a discovery and the professional desire to acquire a rare piece for their collections, were often eager to overlook minor discrepancies. They saw what they wanted to see, a lost piece of history resurfacing in the most ordinary of places. The Amana Princess was purchased by the Bolton Museum for nearly $500,000, hailed as a national treasure and displayed with a reverence that Sean found both amusing and surreal. Sean's life remained remarkably unchanged by the influx of wealth. He didn't buy sports cars or luxury villas. He continued to live in the same house, eating the same meals, and working in the same cold shed. The money was tucked away in savings accounts, largely untouched. His motivation was not the lifestyle of a millionaire, but the quiet satisfaction of the craftsman. He enjoyed the challenge of fooling the experts, proving that a man with a basic education and a set of chisels could outsmart the most prestigious institutions in the world. He lived in a state of constant, silent irony, walking through the galleries of major museums and seeing his own handiwork displayed behind velvet ropes and bulletproof glass. The deception was so perfect that it might never have been discovered if not for a small, technical error in a relief depicting an ancient Assyrian scene. In his effort to be thorough, Greenhalgh had included a detail of a horse's harness that contained a historical inaccuracy, a type of knot that hadn't been invented at the time the piece was supposedly carved. This tiny thread was pulled by a suspicious expert at the British Museum, and the entire tapestry of Sean's career began to unravel. When the police raided the family home, they didn't find a sophisticated laboratory. They found a cluttered garage filled with half-finished statues, jars of instant coffee used for staining, and a set of old tools that had produced millions of dollars worth of history. The trial was a moment of profound embarrassment for the art establishment. Curators had to admit that they had been fooled by items created in a garden shed using materials found at the local hardware store. Greenhalgh was sentenced to prison, but in many ways, he had already won. He had proven that the value we assign to art is often a matter of perception rather than inherent truth. He had exposed the vulnerability of an industry that relies on the expert eye, showing that even the most trained observer can be blinded by the allure of a good story. Today, Sean Greenhalgh's work has found a new kind of fame. Some of his forgeries are actually kept by museums, not as historical artifacts, but as examples of the most successful deceptions in the history of art. They are displayed in fakes and forgeries exhibitions, where visitors marvel at the skill required to mimic the masters. Sean himself returned to a quiet life, occasionally writing about his experiences and the nature of creativity. His story remains a quiet, gliding narrative about the thin line between the authentic and the imagined. It reminds us that our history is not just a collection of facts, but a series of stories we choose to believe. In the silence of that Bolton garage, a man had built a world of shadows, reminding us that sometimes the most unexpected crime is the one that asks us to question the reality of the beauty we see right in front of us. The English countryside is often portrayed as a landscape of gentle rolling hills, ancient hedgerows, and a quiet, unshakable sense of order. In the summer of 1963, this tranquility was shattered by an event that would become a cornerstone of criminal folklore, yet the aftermath of the Great Train Robbery was characterized by a different kind of silence. On a moonlit night in August, a gang of 15 men executed a plan of military precision. They tampered with a railway signal near Ledburn, forcing the Glasgow to London Royal Mail train to a halt in the middle of the dark, isolated expanse of the Buckinghamshire Fields. Within minutes, The robbers had overpowered the crew and made off with over £2 million, a sum that, in today's economy, would represent a staggering fortune. The heist was loud, dramatic, and fast, but the lives that followed were a study in the art of the slow, quiet disappearance. While the police launched one of the most intensive manhunts in British history, the members of the gang were faced with the reality of their success. They had more money than they could possibly spend without drawing attention to themselves in a country where everyone was suddenly looking for a new millionaire. The initial hiding place, Leatherslade Farm, was a modest, isolated property that quickly became a pressure cooker of nerves and cigarette smoke. They realized that the crime itself was only the beginning. The true challenge was the survival of the self in a world that had become a trap. One by one, the men began to peel away from the group, slipping into the shadows of the very society they had just plundered. For many of the robbers, the path to safety lay in the mundane. They didn't seek out tropical islands or high-stakes gambling dens. Instead, they sought the safety of the unremarkable. They moved to quiet suburbs, changed their names, and adopted the lives of middle-aged businessmen, shopkeepers, and tradesmen. They relied on the fact that the human brain is conditioned to look for the extraordinary. No one suspects the polite man who always pays his rent on time and spends his weekends tending to his rose garden of being a fugitive responsible for the crime of the century. They became ghosts living in plain sight, their secret hidden behind the lace curtains and neatly trimmed lawns of suburban England. Consider the life of a man who has millions of pounds buried in his backyard but must still go to work every day to maintain his cover. It is a life of constant, low-level vibration, a state where every knock at the door or every siren in the distance is a potential end to the charade. The weight of the secret is often more exhausting than the crime itself. They had to learn the dialect of their new neighborhoods, invent histories for themselves that were boring enough to discourage further questioning, and slowly, year after year, let the memory of their former selves fade away. They were masters of the uneventful life, proving that the best place to hide is in the middle of a crowd that thinks it already knows who you are. The most famous of the group, Ronnie Biggs, eventually fled to Brazil, where he lived for decades in the vibrant, noisy atmosphere of Rio de Janeiro. But even his life was a form of quiet exile. While he became a minor celebrity, he was a man trapped by his own fame, unable to return to his home or see his family without facing the consequences of that August night. The others, those who remained in Europe or moved to the quiet corners of the Mediterranean, lived even more secluded lives. They became the quiet neighbors who kept to themselves, the men who were always friendly but never familiar. They watched from a distance as the world moved on, as the trains continued to run, and as the mystery of their whereabouts became a staple of Sunday morning newspapers. The true unexpected outcome of the great train robbery was not the theft itself, but the way it transformed the perpetrators into prisoners of their own success. The money, once a symbol of freedom, became a tether that bound them to a life of perpetual caution. As the decades passed, the greatness of the robbery was replaced by the reality of aging and the slow erosion of the men who had committed it. Some were eventually caught, often due to a single, minor slip-up or a moment of misplaced trust. But many others lived out their days in total anonymity, taking their secrets to the grave in the quiet cemeteries of towns that never knew their true names. The heist changed the way the British postal system and the police handled high-value transport, leading to armored carriages and sophisticated communication networks. But the human story remains one of a quiet, gliding exit from the world of the known. It reminds us that the most successful escape is not necessarily the one that involves a fast car or a daring leap, but the one that involves the patient construction of a new, boring reality. The fields near Leadburn are quiet today, the tracks gleaming under the sun, and the trains still rush past the spot where the signal once turned red. The robbery is a piece of history, but the lives of those who disappeared remain a silent, unresolved narrative. A story of men who stole a fortune only to find that the most valuable thing they had was the ability to be forgotten. In the rugged, pine-scented expanse of the Rocky Mountains, the modern world often feels like a distant memory, replaced by the timeless dialogue of wind, stone, and water. It was here, in the vast wilderness that stretches across state lines and through deep, hidden canyons, that an art dealer named Forrest Fenn decided to create a different kind of masterpiece. Fenn was a man who had lived a life of adventure, a former combat pilot and a successful businessman who had spent decades surrounding himself with the physical artifacts of human history. In 2010, at the age of 80, he did something that seemed to belong more to the era of pirate legends than the digital age. He took a 19th century bronze chest, filled it with gold nuggets, rare coins, jewelry, and ancient artifacts, and walked alone into the wilderness to hide it. He didn't provide a map or a set of GPS coordinates. Instead, he wrote a 24-line poem contained within his memoir, The Thrill of the Chase. The poem was a cryptic tapestry of clues. Begin it where warm waters halt, take it in the canyon down, and look for the blaze. To Fenn, the treasure was not a crime or a trick, but a gift to a generation he felt had become too tethered to their screens and their desks. He wanted to give the world a reason to smell the sagebrush, to feel the cold rush of a mountain stream, and to experience the quiet, humbling scale of the American West. He created a mystery that was designed to be solved not by an algorithm, but by the human spirit of exploration. For the next 10 years, the treasure became a modern-day myth. An estimated 350,000 people from all over the world traveled to the Rockies to search for the chest. They spent their vacations poring over topographical maps, debating the meaning of brown and the home of brown, and hiking through remote valleys that had not seen a human footprint in years. The search was a study in collective focus, a global conversation that happened in hushed tones around campfires and on internet forums. It was a crime of passion against the mundane, a rebellion against the idea that everything in the world has already been found and catalogued. The unexpected outcome of the Fenn treasure was not just the discovery of the gold, but the transformation of the searchers themselves. For many, the chase became more important than the chest. They spoke of the silence they found in the high meadows, the way the light changed the color of the granite at sunset, and the sense of peace that comes from being truly lost in a landscape that doesn't care about your name or your bank account. It was a decade of quiet discovery, where the treasure was often the realization that the world is still a place of wonder. Fenn watched from his home in Santa Fe, receiving thousands of emails from people whose lives had been changed by a poem and a dream of gold. The end of the chase came as quietly as it had begun. In June 2020, a man named Jack Stewf, a medical student who had spent 2 years obsessively analyzing Fenn's words and the geology of the region, found the chest. It was tucked away in a spot that was neither dangerous nor inaccessible, but simply overlooked, a place where the shadows and the foliage created a perfect, natural veil. He didn't shout his discovery from the mountaintops. He contacted Fenn, verified the contents, and then retreated into a quiet, protective anonymity. The chest was found exactly as it had been left, its bronze lid weathered by a decade of mountain winters, its interior still shimmering with the treasures of a dozen different civilizations. The discovery brought a sense of closure, but also a lingering melancholy. The mystery that had fueled the imaginations of thousands was suddenly resolved, replaced by the cold reality of a found object. Fenn passed away just a few months after the chest was recovered, his final mission completed. He had succeeded in his goal. He had moved the world, if only by a fraction, back toward the wilderness. The chest was eventually sold, and the artifacts dispersed, but the story of the chase remains a part of the mountains themselves. Today, if you hike through the canyons of the Rockies, you might still see someone pausing by a stream, looking at a particular rock formation or a bend in the river with a knowing, inquisitive eye. The gold is gone, but the spirit of the search persists. The Fenn treasure reminds us that the greatest mysteries are often those we create for one another, the puzzles that ask us to look up from our lives and into the horizon. It was a quiet, gliding adventure that proved that even in the 21st century, there is still room for a legend, still space for a secret, and still a reason to walk into the woods and listen to the silence of the trees. The mountains remain, indifferent and beautiful, holding the memory of the thousands who came looking for gold and found, instead, the quiet, unexpected treasure of the journey itself. Word count, 1038. As the final echoes of these stories fade into the stillness of the room, let the weight of the day begin to lift. The mysteries of the world, the vanished paintings, the silent departures, and the treasures hidden in the deep earth, are all safely tucked away in the archives of history. There is no longer a need to search, to analyze, or to wonder. The world outside is quiet, and the paths through the forest are shrouded in a soft, protective mist. Like the crew of the Mary Celeste or the gardener in the manor, you are moving into a space of absolute peace, where the only rhythm is the steady, calm beat of your own breath. The iron gates are closed, the vaults are secure, and the stars are watching over the vast, silent landscapes we have traveled tonight. Each story was a bridge, leading you further away from the noise of the day and closer to the sanctuary of sleep. Feel the comfort of the blankets, the support of the pillow, and the gradual softening of the world around you. The ink has dried, the coins are at rest, and the secrets of the past are settled. There is nothing left to do but drift. The stories have served their purpose, carrying you to the edge of dreams, where the air is cool and the shadows are kind. Sleep now, knowing that the world remains in a state of quiet, beautiful balance. Good night. Sweet dreams.